April 13, 1933, 8:14 p.m., the Oak Ridge Bistro, Joplin, Missouri. The sound of a heavy silver spoon hitting a porcelain floor usually defines the peak of a crisis in a place like this. But tonight, that sound was drowned out by the rhythmic, metallic clack-clack of a Ford V8 engine idling aggressively just outside the mahogany doors. Inside, the air smelled of expensive cigar smoke, roasted duck, and the faint ozone scent of an approaching Midwestern thunderstorm. Arthur Pendergast, 24 years old and a man who prided himself on being invisible, stood frozen. He was holding a tray of crystal glasses. He was the quiet waiter, the one who knew which judge liked his bourbon neat and which socialite was cheating on her husband. He was a shadow in a white apron. Then the doors didn't just open, they exploded inward. Two figures blurred into the light. One was a man, wiry and moving with a frantic electric energy, a fedora tipped low. The other was a woman, small, with golden hair and eyes that looked like they had seen the end of the world and found it funny. "Don't nobody move, and the air stays inside your lungs," the man barked. His voice was gravel and gasoline. Arthur dropped the tray. The shattering glass was the only protest. The man, Clyde Barrow, didn't point his Browning automatic rifle at the crowd. He walked straight to Arthur. With a grin that was more of a snarl, he reached into his waistband and pulled out a heavy Colt .45. He didn't aim it. He pressed the cold, oil-slicked grip into Arthur's shaking palm. "Hold this, kid," Clyde whispered, his breath smelling of cheap peppermint. "You're tired of serving soup. Tonight you're serving justice." 3 minutes ago, Arthur was worried about a late tip. Now he was holding the weight of a murder charge in his hand, while Bonnie Parker began emptying the register with a rhythmic, terrifying efficiency. To understand how a man who never raised his voice ended up holding a killer's weapon, we have to look at the cracks in the American dream that started long before the first shot was fired. Arthur wasn't born for the shadows, he was refined by them. 6 months prior, Joplin was a city of desperate men and silent women. The Great Depression hadn't just taken the money, it had taken the noise. Men walked the streets like ghosts. Arthur had seen his father, a master carpenter, reduced to begging for scraps of wood to heat their shack. The Oak Ridge Bistro was the only place where the Depression felt like a myth. It was a fortress of the elite. Arthur got the job because he had the face of a secret keeper. He learned to read body language like a map. He knew that Sheriff Holcomb took bribes in envelope number 4 every Tuesday. He knew that the city's lead magnates were selling out their workers to keep the chandeliers lit. Arthur, his manager, a bloated man named Mr. Sterling, would say, "A waiter is a piece of furniture that breathes. If I hear you speak, I've failed in my hiring." Arthur leaned into that silence. He became a master observer. He watched the way the sunlight hit the dust motes in the dining room, and he watched the back alley where the bootleggers made their drops. He hated them all, not because they were rich, but because they were safe. On the night of April 10th, 3 days before the robbery, Arthur was smoking a hand-rolled cigarette in the alley. A black sedan pulled up. No lights. A woman stepped out, her silk dress rustling like a warning. She didn't look at him, but as she passed, she dropped a crumpled napkin. Arthur picked it up. It wasn't a note. It was a drawing of a bird in a cage with the door kicked open. He should have quit then. He should have run. But in a world where everyone was a ghost, Arthur Pendergast was tired of being invisible. He didn't know that the bird wasn't a symbol of freedom. It was a lure. Back in the present, the bistro was a tomb. Bonnie was moving between the tables now. She wasn't just taking jewelry. She was taking dignity. She made the mayor's wife hand over her wedding ring, then made her drop it into a bowl of half-eaten soup. "Keep that gun steady, son," Clyde said, stepping behind Arthur, using the waiter as a human shield. "The police in this town couldn't hit a barn door, but they might get lucky. You're our luck tonight." Arthur's fingers were numb. The Colt .45 felt like it weighed 100 pounds. His mind raced back to his father's workshop. Measure twice, cut once. He was measuring the distance to the door, the distance to the floor, the distance to a life of crime. I can't," Arthur stammered, his voice cracking for the first time in years. Bonnie stopped. She walked over to him, her heels clicking on the hardwood. click, 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 like a firing pin. She reached out and tilted Arthur's chin up with a finger that smelled of cordite. "Sure you can," she whispered. "Look at them, Arthur. Look at Sterling. Look at the judge. They've been robbing you for years with a smile. We're just doing it with a gun. Who's the honest one?" At that moment, Mr. Sterling made a move. He reached for a small derringer kept under the podium. He was slow, panicked, and sweating. "Arthur, shoot him!" Sterling screamed. "Do your job for once!" The command triggered something in Arthur. For years he had done his job. He had been the furniture. He had been the ghost. He looked at Sterling, then at the heavy weapon in his hand. He didn't shoot Sterling. He didn't shoot Clyde. He turned the gun toward the ceiling and pulled the trigger. The roar was deafening. Plaster rained down like snow, coating the expensive stakes and the terrified faces. The silence that followed was even heavier. Arthur wasn't a waiter anymore. He was a participant. The shot alerted the patrolman 2 blocks away. The clock was now ticking, and Arthur Pendergast had just signed his name in blood. "Move! Out the back!" Clyde screamed, grabbed Arthur by the collar of his white vest. They didn't leave him behind. To the world outside, it looked like a kidnapping. To Arthur, as he was shoved into the back seat of the stolen Ford V8, it felt like being swallowed by a hurricane. The car tore away from the curb, tires screaming against the cobblestones. Clyde was driving like a man possessed, weaving through the narrow alleys of Joplin he seemed to know by instinct. Bonnie was in the front seat laughing, a high melodic sound that chilled Arthur to the bone. She was counting the haul, throwing pearls and wads of cash onto the dashboard. "You got stones, kid," Clyde yelled over the roar of the wind. "Most people pee themselves. You shot the sky. I like that. A sense of theater." Arthur was pressed against the leather, the wind whipping through the open windows. Behind them, he could hear the faint, mournful wail of a police siren. It sounded small. It sounded weak. "Where are we going?" Arthur asked, his heart hammering against his ribs. "To the edge of the map," Bonnie replied, turning around to look at him. She handed him a flask of whiskey. "Drink. You're a legend now, Arthur. The waiter who went rogue. By morning, the papers will say you were the mastermind." The realization hit Arthur like a physical blow. By giving him the gun, by making him fire, they hadn't just used him, they had framed him. He wasn't a victim. In the eyes of the law, he was the third member of the Barrow Gang. They roared past the city limits, the streetlights disappearing, replaced by the oppressive darkness of the Missouri countryside. Arthur looked at his hands. They were still white with plaster dust. He realized then that you can't wash away a choice once it's been made, and the police weren't the only ones hunting them. 2 hours later, they were holed up in a derelict farmhouse near Neosho. The air was thick with the smell of damp hay and old grease. Clyde was cleaning his rifles with a devotion that was almost religious. Bonnie was sitting on a crate, smoking, staring at a map by the light of a single kerosene lamp. Arthur sat in the corner, still in his blood-stained waiter's uniform. He felt like a costume piece left over from a play that had ended in a massacre. "Why me?" Arthur asked. Clyde didn't look up. "Because you were there. And because I saw the way you looked at the judge's steak. You wanted to spit in it, but you didn't. You wanted to scream, but you smiled. I don't trust people who scream, Arthur. I trust people who simmer." The tension in the room shifted. A floorboard creaked upstairs. It wasn't the wind. Clyde was on his feet in a second, the bar leveled at the ceiling. Bonnie blew out the lamp. Silence regained its throne, but this time it was lethal. "They're here," Bonnie whispered. "The law?" Arthur asked, his voice a ghost. "No," Clyde said, his eyes narrowing in the dark. "The law waits for morning. These are the boys from the Bistro, the judge's private security. They don't want the money back, Arthur. They want the ledger you saw in Sterling's office." Suddenly, the front door splintered. Not with a knock, but with a sledgehammer. A flashbang went off, blinding Arthur. In the white light, he saw Clyde dancing, literally dancing, as he unleashed a burst of gunfire into the doorway. The quiet waiter realized that he wasn't caught between the law and the outlaws. He was caught between 2 different kinds of monsters, and one of them was standing right in front of him, reloading. The gunfight was short, brutal, and chaotic. 2 men in dark overcoats lay dead on the porch, their blood soaking into the rotting wood. Clyde didn't celebrate. He checked their pockets with a cold professional detachment. "Nothing," Clyde muttered. "They're coming in waves now." He turned to Arthur, the barrel of his gun still smoking. "What ledger, Arthur? What did you see?" Arthur's mind raced. He remembered the night he was cleaning the private dining room. He had seen Mr. Sterling and the judge looking at a black book, laughing about the Joplin accounts. He had seen names, important names, linked to the illegal lead mines and the human trafficking rings that ran through the tri-state district. "It's not just money," Arthur whispered. "It's the whole city. The Bistro is where they keep the books. If that ledger gets out, the judge goes to the gallows and the governor goes with him." Bonnie smiled, a slow, predatory curve of the lips. "Well, well, we didn't just rob a restaurant. We robbed a counting house for the devil." "We're going back," Clyde decided. "If we have that ledger, we don't just have money, we have a shield. They won't shoot us if we can burn their world down." "Back?" Arthur cried. "That's suicide." "Staying here is suicide, kid," Bonnie said, tossing him a fresh magazine for the Colt. "At least back there we choose the ground." They piled back into the Ford. The drive back to Joplin was a descent into a different kind of darkness. The rain began to fall in earnest now, a heavy grey curtain that blurred the line between the road and the abyss. Arthur realized his life was a series of narrow hallways. He had spent his life walking them with a tray. Now he was walking them with a gun, and the end of the hallway was on fire. 3 a.m., the Oak Ridge Bistro. The crime scene tape was fluttering in the wind. The police had come and gone, leaving a single night watchman at the front. The interior was a wreckage of broken glass and shattered dreams. They entered through the kitchen. The smell of cold grease and stale bread hit Arthur like a memory of a past life. He led them through the pantry, past the walk-in cooler where he used to hide to catch his breath. "Sterling's office is behind the wine cellar," Arthur whispered. They moved like smoke. Clyde was the vanguard, Bonnie the rear guard. Arthur was the key. He knew the codes, the hidden latches, the rhythm of the building. They found the office. It was a mahogany-lined tomb of corruption. Arthur walked to the bookshelf, pulled a specific volume of Tennyson's poetry, and the wall clicked open. There it was, the Black Ledger. But as Arthur reached for it, the lights flickered on. Standing in the doorway wasn't the police. It was Mr. Sterling, holding a shotgun, his face twisted in a mask of sweaty desperation. He wasn't alone. 3 men with Tommy guns stepped out from the shadows of the dining room. "I knew you were a rat, Arthur," Sterling hissed. "The quiet ones always are. You think these 2 are your friends? They'll kill you the moment you hand them that book." "Maybe," Arthur said, his voice surprisingly steady. "But you've been killing me for years, one yes sir at a time." The standoff was a microcosm of the entire country. The corrupt elite, the violent desperate, and the man caught in the middle who finally had enough. "Drop the book, Arthur," Sterling commanded, "and I might let you live long enough to reach the prison." Clyde laughed. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. "He's not dropping anything, you bloated tick. Bonnie?" Bonnie Parker didn't use a gun. She threw a kerosene lamp she had grabbed from the hallway. It smashed against the heavy velvet curtains, and the fire roared to life instantly. Chaos erupted. The Tommy guns opened up, stitching the walls with lead. Clyde dived behind the mahogany desk, returning fire with his bar, the heavy rounds punching through Sterling's men like they were made of paper. Arthur grabbed the ledger and dove under the tasting table. The heat was becoming unbearable. The smell of burning expensive wood and fine wine filled the air. "Arthur! The window!" Bonnie shouted, her hair silhouetted by the flames. Arthur looked at the ledger. He looked at Sterling, who was screaming as the fire caught his expensive suit. He saw the greed, the fear, and the absolute hollowness of it all. He didn't run for the window. He ran for the kitchen. He knew the ventilation system. He knew that if he opened the gas valves on the industrial stoves and threw the ledger into the center of the room, the entire building would become a bomb. "Arthur, move!" Clyde yelled, grabbing Bonnie and heading for the smashed front window. Arthur turned the valves. He felt the hiss of the gas on his face. He looked at the ledger, the names of the men who broke his father, who starved his city. He threw it into the growing fire in the kitchen. He leaped through the service entrance just as the Oak Ridge Bistro vanished in a pillar of orange flame. The secret history of Joplin was turned to ash in seconds. The explosion threw Arthur across the alleyway. He woke up to the sound of rain and the distant, frantic ringing of fire bells. The Ford V8 was idling at the end of the alley. Clyde and Bonnie were inside, looking at the inferno. They looked like creatures of myth in the flickering light. Arthur stood up, his uniform shredded, his face blackened by soot. He walked to the car. "The book?" Clyde asked. "Gone," Arthur said, "along with everything else." Clyde stared at him for a long beat. He didn't look angry. He looked impressed. "You didn't want the power, did you, kid? You just wanted to watch the cage burn." "I'm not going with you," Arthur said. Bonnie leaned out. "They'll hunt you, Arthur. You're a cop killer and a bank robber now. You have nowhere to go." "I've been a ghost my whole life," Arthur replied. "I'm good at it." Clyde nodded once. He reached into his pocket and threw a heavy roll of cash at Arthur's feet. "For the tips you never got. Good luck, waiter." The Ford roared, tires biting into the wet pavement, and vanished into the night, heading toward the legends and the eventual ambush at Bienville Parish. Arthur stood in the rain, watching the bistro burn. He was a criminal, a hero, and a dead man walking, all at once. But for the first time in 24 years, he wasn't waiting on anyone. October 1934. 18 months later, a small diner in Oregon. The man behind the counter was older than his years. He moved with a quiet efficiency that suggested deep training. He wore a clean apron and never made eye contact for more than a second. A customer sat down and spread a newspaper on the counter. The headline read, "Bonnie and Clyde Dead, the End of the Barrow Gang." The waiter filled a cup of coffee. His hand didn't shake. "Sad way to go," the customer said. "But they say there was a third one. A waiter from Missouri. They never found his body in the fire. Some say he's the one who really pulled the strings. The quiet mastermind." The waiter smiled. "A small private thing. People like to tell stories," he said. "Helps them sleep." "I suppose," the customer agreed. "Keep the change, son." The waiter watched him leave. He picked up the coin, a silver quarter. He looked at it, then put it in the tip jar. The Oak Ridge Bistro was a parking lot now. The judge was in prison on unrelated charges. The world had moved on, but the legend of the waiter with the gun remained a ghost story told in the backrooms of Joplin. Arthur Pendergast walked to the back of the diner, took off his apron, and looked at his reflection in the darkened window. He was still invisible, but now it was by choice. History remembers the names that are written in blood, but it's the names written in ash that truly change the world. Arthur Pendergast disappeared into the fog of the Great Depression, leaving behind a burning building and a shattered system. But tell us in the comments, if you were in Arthur's shoes, trapped between a corrupt employer and a pair of famous killers, would you have taken the gun, or would you have stayed a ghost? Don't forget to like if you enjoyed this dive into the darker side of the Barrow legacy, and subscribe for more stories of the crimes that defined an era. See you in the shadows.